Part 3. The area was deserted, wild and ominously inhospitable. Geralt didn't return to the highway before dusk. He didn't want to take a roundabout route, so he took a shortcut through the forest. He spent the night on the bare summit of a high hill, his sword on his knees beside a tiny campfire into which, every now and then, he threw wisps of monkshood. In the middle of the night, he noticed the glow of a fire far away in the valley. He heard mad howling and singing, and a sound which only could have been the screaming of a tortured woman. When dawn had barely broken, he made his way there to find nothing but a trampled glade and charred bones and still warm ashes. Something sitting in the crown of an enormous oak shrieked and hissed. It could have been a harpy, or an ordinary wildcat. The Witcher didn't stop to check. About midday, while Roach was drinking at a spring, the mare neighed piercingly and backed away, baring her yellow teeth and chewing her bit. Geralt calmed her with a sign. Then he noticed a regular ring formed by the caps of reddish mushrooms peering from the moss. "You're becoming a real hysteric, Roach," he said. "This is just an ordinary devil's ring. What's the fuss?" The mare snorted, turning her head toward him. The Witcher rubbed his forehead, frowned, and grew thoughtful. Then he leaped into the saddle, turned the horse around, and started back following his own tracks. "Animals like me," he muttered. "Sorry, Roach. It turns out you've got more brains than me." The mare flattened her ears against her skull and snorted, throwing up earth with her hooves. He didn't want to go. Geralt didn't calm her with a sign. He jumped from the saddle and threw the reins over the horse's head. He no longer had his old sword in its lizard skin sheath on his back. Its place was filled with a shining, beautiful weapon with a cruciform and slender, well-weighted hilt ending in a spherical pommel made of white metal. This time, the gate didn't open for him. It was already open, just as he had left it. He heard singing. He didn't understand the words. He couldn't even identify the language. He didn't need to. The Witcher felt and understood the very nature, the essence of this quiet, piercing song which flowed through the veins in a wave of nauseous, overpowering menace. The singing broke off abruptly, and then he saw her. She was clinging to the back of the dolphin in the dried-up fountain, embracing the moss-overgrown stone with her tiny hands, so pale they seemed transparent. Beneath her storm of tangled hair shone huge, wide-open eyes the color of anthracite. Geralt slowly drew closer, step soft and springy, tracing a semicircle from the wall and blue rosebush. The creature glued to the dolphin's back followed him with her eyes, turning her petite face with an expression of longing and full of charm. He could still hear her song, even though her thin, pale lips were held tight and not the slightest sound emerged from them. The Witcher halted at a distance of 10 paces. His sword, slowly drawn from its black enameled sheath, glistened and glowed above his head. "It's silver," he said. "This blade is silver." The pale little face did not flinch. The anthracite eyes did not change expression. "You're so like a rusalka," the Witcher continued calmly, "that you could have deceived anyone, all the more as you're a rare bird. Black-haired one, but horses are never mistaken. They recognize creatures like you instinctively and perfectly. What are you? I think you're a mullah, or an alpor. An ordinary vampire wouldn't come out in the sun." The corners of the pale lips quivered and turned up a little. "Nivellen attracted you with that shape of his, didn't he? You evoked his dreams. I can guess what sort of dreams they were, and I pity him." The creature didn't move. "You like birds," continued the Witcher. "But that doesn't stop you biting the necks of people of both sexes, does it? You and Nivellen, indeed. A beautiful couple you'd make. A monster and a vampire, rulers of a forest castle. You'd dominate the whole area in a flash. You eternally thirsty for blood, and he your guardian, a murderer at your service, a blind tool. But first, he had to become a true monster, not a human being in a monster's mask. The huge black eyes narrowed. Where is he, black-haired one? You were singing, so you've drunk some blood. You've taken the ultimate measure, which means you haven't managed to enslave his mind. Am I right? The black-tressed head nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, and the corners of the mouth turned up even more. The tiny little face took on an eerie expression. No doubt you consider yourself the lady of this manor now. A nod, this time clearer. Are you a mullah? A slow shake of the head. The hiss which reverberated through his bones could only have come from the pale, ghastly, smiling lips, although the Witcher didn't seem to move. Alpor. Denial. The Witcher backed away and clasped the hilt of his sword tighter. That means you're... The corners of the lips started to turn up. Higher and higher, the lips flew open. A Bruxa! The Witcher shouted, throwing himself toward the fountain. From behind the pale lips glistened white, spiky fangs. The vampire jumped up, arced her back like a leopard, and screamed. The wave of sound hit the Witcher like a battering ram, depriving him of breath, crushing his ribs, piercing his ears and brain with thorns of pain, flying backward. He just managed to cross his wrists in the sign of Heliotrop. The spell cushioned some of his impact with the wall, but even so, the world grew dark and the remainder of his breath burst from his lungs in a groan. On the dolphin's back in the stone circle of the dried-up fountain, where a dainty girl in a white dress had sat just a moment ago, an enormous black bat flattened its glossy body, opening its long, narrow jaws wide, revealing rows of needle-like white teeth. The membranous wings spread and flapped silently, and the creature charged at the Witcher like an arrow fired from a crossbow. Geralt, with a metallic taste of blood in his mouth, shouted a spell and threw his hand, his fingers spread in the sign of Quen out in front of him. The bat, hissing, turned abruptly, then chuckled and veered up into the air before diving down vertically, straight at the nape of the Witcher's neck. Geralt jumped aside, slashed, and missed. The bat smoothly, gracefully drew in a wing, circled around him, and attacked anew, opening its eyeless, toothed snout wide. Geralt waited, sword held with both hands, always pointed in the creature's direction. At the last moment, he jumped, not to the side, but forward, dealing a swing cut which made the air howl. He missed. It was so unexpected that he lost his rhythm and dodged a fraction of a second too late. He felt the beast's talons tear his cheek, and a damp, velvety wing slapped against his neck. He curled up on the spot, transferred the weight of his body to his right leg, and slashed backward sharply, missing the amazingly agile creature again. The bat beat its wings, soared up, and glided toward the fountain. As the crooked claws scraped against the stone casing, the monstrous slobbering snout was already blurring, morphing, disappearing, although the pale little lips which were taking its place couldn't quite hide the murderous fangs. The Bruxa howled piercingly, modulating her voice into a macabre tune, glared at the Witcher with eyes full of hatred, and screamed again. The sound wave was so powerful it broke through the sign. Black and red circles spun in Geralt's eyes. His temples and the crown of his head throbbed. Through the pain drilling in his ears, he began to hear voices wailing and moaning, the sound of flute and oboe, the rustle of a gale. The skin on his face grew numb and cold. He fell to one knee and shook his head. The black bat floated toward him silently, opened its toothy jaws. Geralt, still stunned by the scream, reacted instinctively. He jumped up, and in a flash, matching the tempo of his movements to the speed of the monster's flight, took 3 steps forward, dodged, turned a semicircle, and then, quick as a thought, delivered a 2-handed blow. The blade met with no resistance, almost no resistance. He heard a scream, but this time it was a scream of pain caused by the touch of silver. The wailing Bruxa was morphing on the dolphin's back. On her white dress, slightly above her left breast, a red stain was visible beneath a slash no longer than a little finger. The Witcher ground his teeth. The cut, which should have sundered the beast in two, had been nothing but a scratch. "Shout, vampire! he growled, wiping the blood from his cheek. "Scream your guts out, lose your strength, and then I'll slash your pretty little head off." You will be the first to grow weak, sorcerer. I will kill you. The Bruxa's lips didn't move, but the Witcher heard the words clearly. They resounded in his mind, echoing and reverberating as if underwater. "We shall see," he muttered through his teeth as he walked bent over in the direction of the fountain. "I will kill you! I'll kill you! I'll kill you!" "We shall see." "Vrida!" Nivellen, his head hanging low and both hands clinging to the door frame, stumbled from the mansion. He staggered toward the fountain, waving his paws unsteadily. Blood stained the cuff of his tunic. "Vrida!" he roared again. The Bruxa jerked her head in his direction. Geralt, raising his sword to strike, jumped toward her, but the vampire's reaction was much faster. A sharp scream and another sound wave knocked the Witcher from his feet. He tumbled onto his back and scraped against the gravel of the path. The Bruxa arced and tensed to jump, her fangs flashing like daggers. Nivellen spread his paws like a bear, tried to grab her, but she screamed straight into his face, throwing him back against the wooden scaffolding under the wall, which broke with a sharp crash and buried him beneath a stack of timber. Geralt was already on his feet, running, tracing a semicircle around the courtyard, trying to draw the Bruxa's attention away from Nivellen. The vampire, fluttering her white dress, scurried straight at him, light as a butterfly, barely touching the ground. She was no longer screaming, no longer trying to morph. The Witcher knew she was tired, and that she was still lethal. Behind Geralt's back, Nivellen was clattering under the scaffolding, roaring. Geralt leapt to the left, executing a short moulinet with his sword to confuse the Bruxa gliding toward him. White and black, wind-blown, terrible. He'd underestimated her. She screamed. He didn't make the sign in time, flew backward until he thumped against the wall. The pain in his spine shot all the way to the tips of his fingers, paralyzed his shoulders, cut him down at the legs. He fell to his knees. The Bruxa, wailing melodiously, jumped toward him. "Vrida!" roared Nivellen. She turned, and Nivellen forced the sharp broken end of a 3-meter-long pole between her breasts. She didn't shout. She only sighed. The Witcher shook, hearing this sigh. They stood there. Nivellen, on widespread legs, was wielding the pole in both hands, one end firmly secured under his arm. The Bruxa, like a white butterfly on a pin, hung on the other end of the stake, clutching it with both hands. The vampire exhaled excruciatingly and suddenly pressed herself hard against the stake. Geralt watched a red stain bloom on her back, on the white dress through which the broken tip emerged in a geyser of blood. Hideous, almost obscene. Nivellen screamed, took one step back, then another, retreating from her. But he didn't let go of the pole and dragged the Bruxa behind him. One more step, and he leaned back against the mansion. The end of the pole scraped against the wall. Slowly, as if a caress, the Bruxa moved her tiny hands along the stake, stretched her arms out to their full length, grasped the pole hard, and pulled on it again. Over a meter of bloodied wood already protruded from her back. Her eyes were wide open, her head flung back. Her sighs became more frequent and rhythmic, turning into a ruckling wheeze. Geralt stood, but fascinated by the scene, still couldn't make himself act. He heard words resounding dully within his skull, as if echoing around a cold, damp dungeon. "Mine, or nobody's. I love you. I love you." Another terrible, vibrating sigh, choking in blood. The Bruxa moved further along the pole and stretched out her arms. Nivellen roared desperately, and, without letting go of the stake, tried to push the vampire as far from him as possible, but in vain. She pulled herself closer and grabbed him by the head. He wailed horrifically and tossed his hairy head. The Bruxa moved along the pole again and tilted her head toward Nivelin's throat. The fangs flashed a blinding white. Geralt jumped. Every move he made, every step, was part of his nature. Hard-learned, automatic, and lethally sure. 3 quick steps, and the third, like 100 such steps before, finished on the left leg with a strong, firm stamp. A twist of his torso, and the sharp, forceful cut. He saw her eyes. Nothing can change now. He heard the voice. Nothing. He yelled, to drown the word which she was repeating. Nothing could change. He cut. He struck decisively, like hundreds of times before, with the center of the blade, and immediately following the rhythm of the movement, took a 4th step, and half a turn, the blade, freed by the half turn, floated after him, shining, drawing a fan of red droplets in its wake. The streaming raven black hair floated in the air. Floated. 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 The head fell onto the gravel. There are fewer and fewer monsters? And I? What am I? Who's shouting? The birds? The woman in a sheepskin jacket and blue dress? The roses from Nazair? How quiet. How empty. What emptiness within me. Nivelin curled up in a bundle, sheltering his head in his arms, and shaking with twitches and shivers, was lying in the nettles by the manor wall. "Get up," said the Witcher. The young, handsome, well-built man with a pale complexion lying by the wall raised his head and looked around. His eyes were vague. He rubbed them with his knuckles. He looked at his hands, felt his face. He moaned quietly, and putting his finger in his mouth, ran it along his gums for a long time. He grasped his face again and moaned as he touched the 4 bloody swollen streaks on his cheek. He burst out sobbing, then laughed. "Geralt? How come? How did this... Geralt!" "Get up, Nivelin. Get up and come along. I've got some medicine in my saddlebags. We both need it." "I've no longer got... I haven't... Have I? Geralt, why?" The Witcher helped him up, trying not to look at the tiny hands, so pale as to be transparent, clenched around the poles stuck between the small breasts, which were now plastered with a wet red fabric. Nivelin moaned again. "Verena!" "Don't look. Let's go." They crossed the courtyard, holding each other up, and passed the blue rose bush. Nivelin kept touching his face with his free hand. "Incredible, Geralt! After so many years! How is it possible?" "There's a grain of truth in every fairy tale," said the Witcher quietly. "Love and blood. They both possess a mighty power. Wizards and learned men have been racking their brains over this for years, but they haven't arrived at anything except that." "That what, Geralt?" "It has to be true love."